Good afternoon. Good afternoon. This is Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99, broadcasting from Kingston, Jamaica. But a little after 1 o'clock, we're going to hook up with our sister station, Ari Jam, in New York. They're going through some difficult times, terrible weather, blizzards, and somewhere in Boston there was something like 3 feet of snow. Many of us in Jamaica, we don't know what that is like, but it is hell, and I hope that the Jamaican community in the whole of that area, in the tri-state area, all the way up to Boston, I hope they are keeping themselves safe. I hope they are faring well. Today is the 31st of January. I can't believe that we are at the end of the first month of the year. Not long from now, we're going to be hearing Christmas carols all over again. You know, I remember when I was a youngster growing up, a week looked like an eternity. As you get older, well, at this age of my life, a year looks like a week. The way things move. But welcome to the program. I'm Bruce Golding. This is Jamaica Live. We try on this program we do one issue every program. We spent the whole 2 hours because, you know, when you try and do 3, 4, 5 different issues, you rush through them. And when you're through, you get a sense that people didn't get a chance to fully appreciate the points that were being made. So we're an issues program. We're a discussion program. We invite guests here who can help us to understand these issues. And we try to select issues that are important to us as a people. And we try our best to discuss them in a way that people can understand. And people can form their own views and come to their own opinions and conclusions. So that basically is what we're about. When we talk about government, we sometimes mean different things. We may be talking about the ruling party, whether that be JLP or PNP, and, you know, the people who run the country. But the government is much broader than that. It involves all the ministries, the departments, the agencies that carry out the functions of the state, apply the laws and regulations, implement official policies and programs, administer public services, you know, like our schools, our hospitals, our markets, manage traffic on the road, maintain law and order. In recent times, we have been talking increasingly about something called governance. Governance is different from government. Governance is a little more difficult to define and understand. It deals with how the government is structured, how it operates, how it makes decisions, how it goes about implementing those decisions, how accessible it is to the people. Can the people reach their government? How it relates to and responds to the people. And importantly, governance involves how is the government held accountable? What is in place to ensure that those who govern us do so in accordance with the law, that they do not exercise powers that they do not have, that when they abuse or violate the trust of the people, they are held responsible and they are made to face the consequences. We elect governments every 5 years. In a vibrant democracy, in a well-functioning democracy, we can't just sit back and wait for another 5 years to concern ourselves with how well we have been governed. By that time, too much damage may have been done. too many opportunities may have been wasted. A government must be held accountable every day. And those who govern us must be aware that this is not a final exams business. They are sitting exams every day because the people are watching them and the people are holding them accountable. The World Bank publishes each year its ranking of countries based on what they call 6 governance indicators. And I mentioned them very briefly. One is voice and accountability. That is a confusing name. But that has to do with, whether or not people have the right to vote, whether they enjoy freedom of expression, press freedom, freedom of association, and so on. Some of the things that, for example, are guaranteed in our Charter of Rights. Secondly, political stability. That has to do with how governments come to office and the extent to which their legitimacy is recognized and accepted by the people. I mean, we have seen situations from time to time where a government is elected and the majority of the people say, no, it's a bogus government, that. Because something was wrong with the election. I mean, look at what Trump is doing in the United States now. Him said the election was rigged, although he hasn't been able to provide 1 ounce of evidence. But political stability, and this is why America is in a very wobbly position right now, because I'm not sure that they could claim, certainly not on this count, political stability, which has to do with the extent to which the legitimacy of the government is widely recognized and accepted. The third indicator that the World Bank uses has to do with government effectiveness. And that deals with how government arrives at its decisions, how it carries out its functions, the quality of the services that it provides. When you go to the hospital, the ease with which you get attended to. When you call 119, whether or not the number just keeps ringing or you get a response and you feel that the government is working because the systems of government are doing what they're supposed to do. The fourth area of governance assessment that the World Bank uses is something they call regulatory quality. And what they're talking about there is the measures that are in place to enable individuals to pursue their goals and their ambitions without impairing the ability of other persons to do the same. So, whether you're doing business, whatever it is, there has to be in place regulations to ensure that you don't pursue your own objectives and do your own business and enjoy your own self, but you do so. For example, take the Night Noise Business Act. That's a regulation that says, fine, have your parties, have your dance, nice up yourself. But if you have a lady who suffers from heart condition or who got a stroke and who need her sleep, you mustn't disturb her. You can't enjoy yourself at her expense. So that's what they mean when they talk about the quality of the regulatory framework that is in place to protect each of us from each of us. And then the fifth criteria that the World Bank refers to has to do with the rule of law, the extent to which laws are respected, and the effectiveness and fairness with which they are enforced. Now, when you look at some indiscipline we have in Jamaica and the lawlessness, you may be tempted to say, well, we fail on that one because we don't have the rule of law. That's not so. I mean, we have laws, and people know that the laws exist, so that, if you break the law and police arrest you, well, you get a lawyer. But but you know that you're breaking the law. You broke into a man's house. You know that you're not supposed to do that. So that has to do with the rule of law. And then finally, and this one, of course, is very important, question of the control of corruption, the prevention of corruption. That deals with the probity and the integrity of those who govern and the mechanisms that are in place to ensure that public officials don't use their authority and the positions that they hold to benefit themselves and their friends. We hope later on in the program to get some indication as to how Jamaica is faring on this World Bank index, on this ranking, because every year they publish their assessment of all the countries all over the world. And we will want to hear how Jamaica is stacking up against other countries on these criteria that they have set out. But the issue, I believe, is even broader than that. It includes the level of people participation in how the government is chosen. Remember that in a previous program, we discussed the low level of voter turnout in our general elections. And therefore, in terms of governance, one of the issues that would affect the quality of our governance is the extent to which people take elections seriously, engage themselves, find out what the candidates and the political parties are saying, question them about it, and then on election day you go there and you vote. Vote for those who you feel have presented you with the best possibilities and the best options. It has to do as well with the level of trust that people have in the government. And there have been several public opinion polls that have shown that that level of trust, the trust that the people have in the government, it don't matter whether it's PNP or JLP government, it is something that has been occurring for a long time. That level of trust is low. And governance also has to do with the flow of information between the government and the people and the level of consultation that takes place between the government and the people on decisions and actions that affect them. You know, whether the government is simply, we have the power, we are going to decide and we are going to march off expecting that people are going to follow behind you. Well, if government behave that way, one day you'll find that after you have marched a good 2 or 3 miles, when you look back, the people are not with you because you didn't consult them. You didn't ask them their views. You didn't give them the information. You didn't explain to them what you're proposing to do so that they could buy into it, or they could make suggestions as to how your plan could be improved. I published an article recently in which I argued that despite all of our shortcomings, and we have plenty, but despite all our shortcomings, we still have a lot to be thankful for. We still have a lot to be proud about, especially when we look at what is taking place in countries like the United States. I believe there's so much that we could teach them. But we cannot ignore the shortcomings, and today we want to focus on some of them, how we can do better. Tony Rebel had a song, many of you remember it, where he said, "What a nice place to live, sweet jam down." But we can make it nicer. And that's what we're talking about today. And no break. Oh, fine. And my first guest on the program is somebody who I'm so delighted to have, a very distinguished Jamaican, serves his country in so many capacities. Let me welcome to the program Professor Alvin Wint. Professor Wint, are you there?
I am very much here, PM. Thank you so much for both your welcome and your extremely insightful and useful introduction.
Tell me something. I mean, you wear so many hats. You have so many titles that if I were to introduce you properly, we wouldn't have any time to have discussions, no? And then I noticed that you have recently been appointed chairman of the Heart Trust. I can't think of a better appointment. Can't think of a better person. I wish you well.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciated.
Tell me, a lot of people, when they hear the term governance, they know it has something to do with government. But can you help me to define it? What is governance? When we talk about governance, what do we mean?
Well, I think you did an extraordinary job in your introduction. But essentially, as you pointed out, it represents the systems that are in place to ensure that a country or an organization is run effectively. And there are, sort of multiple such systems. In the case of a country, again, as you pointed out, I mean, we elect a government in our parliamentary process, in our democratic process, periodically. But that is one element, but again, as you pointed out, far from the complete process. And so you also need to understand how the citizenry of the country hold the government that has been elected accountable, and then also how other institutions in the country are managed, are run, how individuals are appointed to the various positions of governance and authority, how those individuals are held accountable, how information flows from the people, the government to the people, and vice versa. So it really is all about, how do you, at a national level, when we're talking about governance at a national level, how do you ensure that you have the right systems, processes, institutions, structures, and even approaches in place to ensure that you have the best opportunity for a country to be run effectively?
All right, let's look at Jamaica's situation, because if we were having this discussion, for example, in Haiti, one of the big issues, of course, would be we don't have a proper system for electing a government.
Right.
Jamaica, fortunately, and you're a member of the Electoral Commission, Jamaica, fortunately, has...
Former member.
Former member, I thought you were still there. But, yeah. But Jamaica, we can tick that off and say, well, we're doing pretty well there, right?
Correct.
But is it possible for us to identify in Jamaica's case what are the big ticket issues of governance? Is it the efficiency of government functioning and delivery of services? Is it a question of corruption? What you consider to be the real critical issues that we perhaps need to concern ourselves about and need to do better with?
Well, I'm going to piggyback off your introduction because I thought it was so useful in terms of the using the indicators from the World Bank. So let me just go through them quickly and indicate where do I think we have our principal challenges in Jamaica. In terms of voice and accountability, I think we do very well. We do very well on press freedom. In fact, in terms of press freedom, Jamaica is one of the highest ranking countries in the world. And those of us who live here can see that because our press is very, very diligent. It is inquisitive. It interrogates effectively, and it's really not intimidated. So we do well on the press freedom front. We do well on voting freedom. Now, we have had challenges on that front in the past, as you're well aware, where there have been times where there has been voter intimidation and also levels of voter corruption. We haven't solved those problems completely, but we have improved significantly. And you were one of the architects that following on the instructions of Edward Siaga and Michael Manley back in the 70s. I think you were one of the first individuals who they asked to come together to try to put in place the then Electoral Advisory Committee. And that really has been a historical achievement for Jamaica in terms of our multi-sectoral approach to electoral administration that then transitioned into the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, and it is really one of Jamaica's jewels. And we don't have time to get into that discussion, but just to say that I think on that front we do well, although there are issues that we need to improve. On political stability, we have an excellent record of electoral transition from one party to another. We have had, again, challenges in the past, but I would say especially, post 1980, we have done a pretty good job of transitioning from government to government, and this is especially in contrast, as you point out, to the recent situation in the United States of America, which was amazingly, just we couldn't figure out what was happening there. I think in terms of government effectiveness, this is one of the areas that we have some challenges, especially in terms of service quality. But I think that is as much a function of our resource challenges as it is of everything else. So I don't think it's a situation where our government entities are ill-intentioned in terms of their willingness to provide effective services. But in the context of our low income levels, which if we had time we could get into as to why that is the case, and our infrastructural challenges, we have an imbalance between the infrastructural resources, including personnel available to provide government services, and the demand for those services. So that's a challenge. Our regulatory quality is very good. We have, and this again is something that has improved over time. When I say we're very good, I mean I should pause there because there are different elements of it. If you take an organization like the Office of Utility Regulation, that was only really recently established. I mean, I think that was established in Jamaica in about 1995. And that has done a very good job of regulating our utilities. But there are other elements of our regulatory process that are challenged. And we've seen recent examples of the challenges associated with the development approval process. And there are other examples where, again, we have not come to grips with the resources required and the systems required to regulate effectively. In terms of the rule of law, we have some challenges there in terms of law enforcement. I mean, you mentioned the issue of night music. Well, that's an example where, we have the laws in place, but we have had a great degree of difficulty enforcing some of those laws. But I think the biggest issue for Jamaica in the context of rule of law, it has been our ability to effectively deal with our crime and murder problems. And that's where, we rank 1, 2, or 3 in the world. And that's not just about whether laws are in place. We have the laws that are in place, but for a long time, again, we haven't had the kind of intelligent and intelligence-driven approach to law enforcement in the areas of crime. And there are many, many efforts that have gone into trying to improve the capacity of the JCF, the capacity of our border protection agencies. So there's an infrastructural challenge there. But I think there's also been a challenge of focus and recognition that when you are 1, 2, or 3 in the world, worst in this case, in terms of murders, every single element of the society needs to come together to address that particular problem. And I think we haven't done as well as we need to on that. On the control and prevention of corruption, we have, again, improved institutionally in recent years. I mean, we know that we now have an integrity commission. We know that we have a very effective Auditor General office that, that office has really come into its own in recent times and has highlighted areas where there have been conflict of interest issues, abuse of public resources. So the institutional structure and we've had recent law improvements. We have some now that are under contemplation. We've had the Proceeds of Crime Acts. We now have a process to try to deal with disclosure of assets and unexplained wealth orders, which is a part of the crime consensus agreement that was forged between our 2 major political parties and elements of civil society in 2020. So we're seeing movement in that direction, but we still don't rank as high as we ought to in terms of control and prevention of corruption. And there is a notion that in certain quarters of our public service, there is a very significant level of corruption. Now, some of this is system-based, and you have to put the appropriate systems in place. Just to give you an example, before we had our ticketing system in terms of the trafficking process, corruption was absolutely rife because of the complexities and the bureaucracy associated with prosecuting individuals who had, disobeyed traffic regulations. I think the ticketing system improved that. You can see the same kind of situation with our certificate of fitness process, where you go back 20, 25 years in Jamaica, and corruption was absolutely rampant because the system was so awkward and it facilitated a corrupt process. So we have system-based changes that we're making to deal with these issues, but we still have a fundamental. I've been going on very long, PM, but just to make a quick point on the information flow and the trust and consultation issues, I think, again, here we're seeing useful progress in Jamaica. There is currently a movement afoot to have us have an open government system where there is a far greater information flow, and we're a part of an international grouping that is moving on that, and the Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Dr. Clark, is working hard on putting that into place. In terms of consultation, again, I want to commend you because you were the Prime Minister that started in a structured way the National Partnership Council process, which involves an ongoing dialogue between government and key members of civil society, inclusive of the representation of the parliamentary opposition. And that National Partnership Council has been meeting pretty much without a break across all administrations since you started that process in 2009. So that is, I think, a tribute to Jamaica. There are challenges in the process, as council members would certainly indicate. But if you take it at a high level, what we have there in Jamaica is a structured way in which the government is seeking to engage in consultation and dialogue. And then there are other manifestations of that consultative process. So if I could sum up, Jamaica, I would say, in relation to governance, is probably somewhere in the middle of the world in terms of the quality of our governance structures, which is kind of where we are in our income levels. But there are key elements of our operations that are much lower. The management of murder and the extent to which we murder our citizens, we're at the bottom of the world. Prior to the initiative in 2012, 2013, where we really came together as a country and tried to deal with our debt crisis, we were one or two in the world in terms of our ability to manage our fiscal affairs. Where you are in situations where you're one, two, or three of the worst in the world, you need to come together as a country to deal with these problems in a focused way. And I think that is really what we have to work on now.
Let me raise one aspect of it with you, Professor Wint. And I'm almost sure you'll agree with me that a government cannot effectively hold itself accountable. It has to be held accountable, no?
Absolutely.
And that is going to require an informed, engaged, assertive citizenry. Now, discuss that with me a little bit as to how is Jamaica doing in terms of the engagement of the citizens. Now, I know we call them civil society groups, right? Which is a term that we perhaps even shouldn't even bother to try to define. But I've always had a concern that some of civil society, of course, are vested interests, no? I mean, the trade unions have a vested interest. The private sector organization has a vested interest. They have certain things on their agenda. We use the term stakeholders to broadly refer to people who ought to be not only admitted to the room, but given a seat at a table somewhere. we run the risk, of course. I mean, some very vocal civil society organizations that I know of could hold their annual general meetings in a telephone booth. Now, how do you go about engaging the citizenry? And what responsibility does the citizenry have itself to become engaged? Instead of just sitting on the, you know what, sometimes, and government gets very cocky, government gets very complacent, they can do what they like because the people have gone to sleep. How are we doing in terms of the activism of the broad citizenry that we want to get engaged?
Well, I think one of the sort of statements that people make sometimes is that people get the governments that they deserve, and I think that links a little bit to your question. What is our level of interest at in government? I am optimistic on that front, in the sense that, there are quite a few civil society organizations with which I have interacted, and I find them to be very interested in pursuing more effective structures for the country. And yes, many of them are single interest or relatively narrow interest, but when I have dialogue with them, they're often concerned about the national interests as well, whether it's a private sector organization or our environmental groups or our integrity groups. Yes, they're focused on the environment, and they're focused on private sector, the environment for the private sector to operate, or they're focused on the challenge of dealing with corruption and enhancing integrity and accountability in the part of the government. But they're not just focused on those issues for the sake of it. I mean, they really are interested in how the country moves along. I think that programs such as this one. I mean, Jamaica has a very, very vibrant radio talk show culture. And individuals who call in, yes, they may have their particular concerns and interests, but they're also very worried about the country and how the country can improve. So I don't think, again, I think if we were to stack up ourselves internationally in terms of the level of agitation and activism, I think we'd rank quite highly. Sometimes there are indicators that are used on that front that I don't think tell the whole story. So let's take the issue of voter apathy and our low level of turnout on elections. At one level, that might seem to suggest that we have a very apathetic citizenry who have no interest in the governance of the country. But I don't think that is the best way of looking at issues of voter turnout. And I use as an example, our highest level of voter turnout in Jamaica, certainly in recent times, was in 1980, when the country was in a fundamental crisis and when the positions of the two major political parties at least appeared to be diametrically opposed. And in that context, this galvanized the citizenry into going to the polls. I don't know that we want to have that kind of a crisis or diametrically opposed position between our parties to be the conduit through which we have high levels of voter turnout. Part of the challenge with voter turnout in Jamaica, I would humbly suggest, is actually in some respects a good thing. It leads to our issue of political stability, and that is that our citizenry find it pretty difficult to distinguish between the policy positions of our two major political parties. Because in many respects, the PMP, which was historically quite left of center, has moved much closer to the center, and so it is narrowly left of center. And the JLP, which historically would have been right of center, has moved very close to the center and is sort of marginally right of center. And so you really have a situation where, because there is no fundamental perspective on policy differences, people don't feel the same kind of galvanization. Now, some people would suggest that, It's because they find that both parties are bad. I have a different perspective. I think that there are fantastic people in both parties, and I think that they're both good. But I'm told that my position is a minority position in the country. But regardless of whether you think they're both pretty bad or both pretty good, to the extent that you think that they're both pretty much the same, it reduces the fundamental drive to vote. So the point I'm making is that it's not an indication, in my view, of the citizenry's lack of interest in effective governance.
Let's go back and zero in a little bit on the question of citizen engagement. Now, the partnership, for example, is a pretty formal architecture that involves stakeholders, no? Civil society stakeholders.
Right.
But I'm just trying to see if we perhaps don't need to encourage. Well, let me preface that by saying this. Over in fairly recent times, we have had situations, for example, when it comes to environmental permits, where public meetings have to be held to give people an opportunity to raise issues and concerns and to be informed and so on. I don't know what the response has been in terms of people turning out and participating. I know, for example, that when we had constitutional reform discussions some time ago, and we went all over the island, town halls and meetings and so on, the turnout and the response was very, very poor. What do we need to do? I had an experience. Many years ago, I went to a conference in Copenhagen. And because of, flight arrangements, I got there a day ahead of time. And the officials who were handling my visit mentioned that there was a meeting that was going to be held that day. It was when I was minister responsible for housing. There was a meeting that was going to be held that day, and wanted to know whether or not I would be interested in attending. This meeting was, a developer proposed to build a shopping center. He had got all of the regulatory approvals, but the regulations required that a meeting be held of the citizens of that particular town, and the citizens had to vote to approve it before final approval could be given. And when I went to the meeting, I was amazed, at the turnout, at the extent to which people were engaged. They wanted to know what impact it's going to have in terms of traffic. They wanted to know what kind of businesses are going to be operating there, whether it is going to be the kind of businesses that they don't want their children exposed to, and so on. Do we need to do something to ensure that the citizens in Alligator Pond, other than trying to find their MPs, and many constituents will complain that they don't see the MPs, no? What can we do to ensure that the citizens, whether it is in Alligator Pond or it is in Wait a Bit, that there's some opportunity where they can assemble, no? Where they can be engaged. I remember years ago, around about the time of independence, it was the kind of thing that what was then Government Information Service used to do. Because I remember in my community where I was growing up, they came and they held meetings there, and people got a chance to. I remember the one in Old Harbour, the speaker there was someone who just passed away, Kerry Robinson. Do we need to engage them, or do we just leave them to their own disengagement?
No, I think we need to engage. I think that there is a reservoir of interest, because when you go into the communities, I mean, as you know, I spent the important formative years of my life in St. Elizabeth, and I think when you talk to people in rural Jamaica, they have an absolute massive interest in the development, both the community and the national development processes, but there need to be appropriate structures through which they can engage. So I think there needs to be an architecture there. But I also, would go on to say that, and I keep sort of focusing on where we are in relation to other countries. A lot of the highest levels of citizenry engagement are in countries where income levels are high and individuals don't feel that, going to meetings such as this is taken away from their key earning opportunities, and also that the societies have demonstrated that those meetings work, and so there is a value-added process.
Well, might it not make sense if we were, rather than trying to go, sort of invent the wheel all over again?
Yes.
Every community has some organizations,
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe if we were to sort of create a network to engage those, to at least give those a sense that they do have lines of communication, that they can transmit their ideas, their complaints, their suggestions, that they can get a response. Is it something that the partnership would perhaps look at?
I think, well, let me say two things. One, I was going to go on to say, PM, that where people feel that their inputs lead to effective changes, it's a little easier to get them involved. Let me give you an example, and it's an example with which you're quite familiar. I recall in the 1970s, and I was a young man then, going to all of these discussions about constitutional reform. And, we were so excited about, the prospect of having fundamental changes in our constitutional process, because I think many of us feel that we have an anachronistic and a highly vestigial structure that is actually quite embarrassing. But yet, 50 odd years on, we really haven't changed very much. You made some key efforts to change our governmental structure at another point in your career, and it didn't pan out. And I think that kind of frustration also translates to some level of, willingness and interest in participating in those processes. So I do think that, we have to find a way to make sure that consultation and dialogue, does lead to effective change, and then it becomes a virtuous circle instead of a vicious cycle. So in terms of the partnership, yes, that is something that the partnership should focus on, and actually in an earlier period actually of the partnership, I think is when Berkshire Whiteman was the coordinator of the Simpson-Miller administration. We actually spent quite a bit of time going around the country and talking to different groups about the importance of partnering across all sectors. And I think you can do some of that, but if we don't, in a sense, change significantly our trajectory as a country in terms of individuals' feelings that the country is moving along, you're always going to get some level of frustration with those meetings. And this is why, I go back to my issue of sequencing. If we identify situations, and again, I take our murder situation where we're 1, 2, or 3 in the world, and we recognize that reverberates right throughout every other part of the Jamaican psyche. Its time is business, its time is visitor arrivals, which are massively lower than what Jamaica would otherwise be able to experience, given the phenomenal quality of our country in terms of its beauty and the highly effervescent and wonderful nature of our people. If we don't deal with the fundamental challenges where we're the worst in the world, then a lot of the other things that we try to do are going to be confronted by the obstacle of hopelessness, which is so rampant in our country now, where there's this feeling of hopelessness, and so negativism abides, and there's a problem found in every solution, because we're so tied into this narrative that we're an underperforming country and society. So, these efforts at engagement are critical, but I think our governance operations at the highest levels have to participate across the length and breadth of the country in terms of dealing with solutions. But I think we have to prioritize. We get a much bigger bang out of dealing, as we did with the debt crisis. When we dealt with that debt crisis and we moved from 150% of GDP to 100% of GDP, so many things started to change. And, all of a sudden you saw the shoots of economic growth coming into play. You saw institutions functioning much better. You saw business and consumer confidence increasing. And it had this ripple effect. If we could get murders in Jamaica down to, even the level that they were in 1980, 800 murders per year. I mean, imagine the ripple effects that would translate into how we feel about ourselves. So I'm not saying it's a one-dimensional problem, but I am suggesting that we need to be. Sometimes we worry too much about elements in Jamaica where we're not nearly as bad as even if our management of COVID-19. Yes, it's a problem, but when you look at Jamaica's COVID-19 cases, our hospitalization levels, our deaths, we're not the worst in the world. We're not the best either, but we're somewhere in the middle.
Professor Wint, I've run out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining me today. It has been a very, very useful and instructive discussion. Okay. I'm sure the listeners would have appreciated the way in which you outlined and presented the issue of governance. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. All the best.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah. Bye.
Welcome back. It's Jamaica Live. We're on Bridge 99. We're talking today about the issue of governance, and I'm so pleased to welcome to the program now Miss Jeanette Calder, who is the Executive Director of the Jamaica Accountability Meetup Portal. Miss Calder, welcome to the program. Do we have her? Not yet. Trying to get her. Jamaica Accountability Meetup Portal is a civil society organization which has been in the news. They've been monitoring the conduct of government, and I know that they have a particular emphasis on corruption. Is she on now? Miss Calder?
Hi, good afternoon, Mr. Golden.
I thought you were avoiding me.
Look, I have been looking forward to this conversation for about a decade. No such luck.
You know something? I'm going to be unfair to you, and I tell you from the beginning.
Go ahead.
On the question of governance, on a scale of 1 to 10, I looked at the World Bank indicators, but they're so confusing. I don't know if they have any composite one, but I had to look at different tables under different headings. Mm-hmm. But on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put us?
Okay, I heard when you started this morning setting the context for us with not just the definition alone, but you gave us a good handle on what are the different aspects that come together, create good governance. And there are like about 8 of them. I have them right here in front of me. And if I pull them apart, Mr. Golden, and I look at accountability, which I place at the top of the 8, we're not going very far without that. I am afraid, what's the scale you gave me, 1 to 10? I would put us at a 2 for accountability. For transparency, I believe we have been stepping backwards instead of going forward, and I can share with you why. So on a scale of 1 to 10 for transparency, I would probably give us a 4 or 5, somewhere around there. Responsiveness. The people have spoken, the people have needs, the people are saying, we're not happy with this, or we would like some help with that. How responsive is the government? This is probably the one, Mr. Golding, that has me doing what I do. And that might seem a little strange to folks, but from my observation over the last, 2 decades, I would stand firm on the fact that when the Jamaican people press in, we have leaders that I consider to be significantly irresponsible sometimes, but I find that when the Jamaican people lean in and press in, we have political leaders who are responsive. So I think if we do our part, I would certainly give the government a grade of about 7 for responsiveness. Now, it would be good if we didn't have to press in, but I can think of so many jurisdictions on the planet where even when you do, you get nothing. So for me, that's a significant plus. The rule of law, I would agree with Professor Wint in terms of the regulatory framework, the institutional framework, the legal framework. I think they're very robust in Jamaica. What we lack is the enforcement of law. So the rule of law in too many instances don't apply. And there's not so much equity as I would like in how it is applied. In terms of rule of law, I probably would give us a 6. Stability, definitely. I would give Jamaica an 8, going up to a 9 for that. Equity and inclusiveness, I haven't followed that as much. Empowerment of the people, I think from the 1930s when we started on the road of self-determination with the Jamaica Progressive League, we've been seeking that, a little bit more balance of power. I think in the context of where we are in 2022, we should have been far much further than that, Mr. Golding. So I would honestly give us a 5. And broad-based participation, there are some areas where Jamaica has just been stellar with that. And I think back to Christine Lagarde's comment about the way that public, private, the trade unions, the private sector, all of us leaning in and pulling together to get us through the IMF was one really good example of what I would say participation where the government reaches out and accepts help. However, as a broad-based comment, there is not enough participation for a 2022 governance. So overall, I think I would put us at probably nowhere better than a 6.5 out of 10.
I want to pin you down a little bit on two of the areas that you just covered.
Sure.
On the question of rule of law, I remember some time ago, I don't know what the numbers are now. I looked at the logjam in our court system. At that time, we had over 300,000 backlog cases that were traversing from one year to the next, no? And that figure had been fairly constant for a number of years.
A good while.
I know the Chief Justice announced that he was taking certain steps to bring it down, but I haven't revisited the numbers, so I don't know where they're at now. But each year we had, don't hold me to the figure, but it was some comparable number of new cases that came into the system. Now, albeit a lot of them were traffic violations, no? Speeding and so on.
Okay.
But even then, a country of less than 3 million people, what kind of court system we could ever have to deal with so much cases?
Well, I tell you.
I mean, why we break law so much?
I think we break law so much because we have gotten used to the idea that there are very little consequences for the laws when we break it. And I'm not just saying that because it's the cliche thing to say. I really do believe that that's the case. The area of the rule of law that JAMP focuses on has to do specifically with matters such as, public financial management, how we are managing the public funds. So we take a closer look, for example, at things like the procurement law. Jamaica for a very long time was guided in terms of how we get, goods and services from the private sector by a policy. Mind you, that policy had quite a bit of what we still have now in the law in terms of sanctions. But, people look at policy and see it as a little less, stringent. So we codified the policy, for example, and we have a procurement law since 2015. Let us say operationalized since 2018, 18, 19, 20, 21, 5 years going now. And Mr. Golding, what JAMP recognizes, especially from the dependents on the Auditor General's work, is that there is a flagrant disregard for that law. And I would say that I could quote to you example after example, page after page of these reports that come to us every year, special reports during the year, that tells us that there are several public bodies, ministries, departments, and agencies. And I am at a loss to understand, for example, how is it no one is put before the court for what I consider to be as a complete ignoring of such a crucial and important law. I'll share this with you.
Where does it fall off the chair?
Where does it? Well, the Auditor General will tell you, and it is true in law, she has no sanctioning powers. And as you know, her reports go right back to the parliament, where our elected representatives are there, supposedly to be monitoring the government. Now, we have the PACs and the PAACs. But at the end of the day, Mr. Golding, when we're finished with those hearings...
Pause there. If the Auditor General puts out something, I'm told that I have to take a break. Can you bear with me? I really want to continue this.
Certainly.
We'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back. This is Jamaica Live on the Bridge. You know, there's a television monitor in the studio, and it's running CNN. And what it has on it now says, Trump vows to pardon Capitol rioters if he's reelected. Can some psychiatrists get hold of this man? Huh? But back to you, Ms. Calder. What I wanted to raise with you is this. We were talking about the question of corruption and procurement irregularities and so on. The question I want to ask you, if somebody puts on social media a video of my menacing somebody with a gun, or of my beating the daylights out of a child, the police go and turn up at my door. I mean, they want to hear about this gun, and they want to see whether or not this child, you know, and I may very well be arrested. If the Auditor General puts out something and said, look, I found the following things. I don't have the power to arrest nobody. I am only here to disclose. Why does any entity, whether it is the Integrity Commission or the police, why are they waiting on some formal referral written in gold lettering?
Well, I've asked that very same question myself, Mr. Golding, and what I would say to you is we have two different kinds of sanctions that I think we can draw for. We have something called administrative sanctions that immediately, and that takes place in private sector every day, and there's no reason why it can't take place in the government on the back of an Auditor General's report. An Auditor General's report, as you know, is a very serious report. She says it all the time in the Parliament. I give my reports based on documentation or the lack thereof. It's black and white. So
bear in mind, of course, that not all of the irregularities that the Auditor General may identify are necessarily criminal in nature, but some of them are, you know.
But that is precisely the way, Mr. Bowen, I'm making a distinction between criminal sanctions and administrative. Because if there are rules and regulations and protocols that, let's say, for example, let's give a simple example. We have a hotel here in New Kingston, and there's a contract with a security firm. And everybody knows nobody's to park in the reserve spots because they're for the CEO and the owner and the managing director. And I'm telling you, as simple as you see that, if I drive in now and I recognize the security guard and he recognizes me from primary school and give me a blight and I park in that spot, my job is on the line if that CEO comes in and realizes he doesn't have somewhere to park. Now, did he commit a crime? No. But he broke a rule that was sacrosanct. And that is an administrative sanction. Now, when you get an Auditor General's report, and I'll give you an example so that we're not speaking in abstract. Jamaica Constabulary Force, $2.2 billion spent, and I'll tell you on what? Three things. Meals for detainees, clothing for police officers, and repairs and maintenance of facilities. Out of that $2.2 billion, $1.8 billion, which is 81%, is spent without public tender and without anybody knowing about it other than all the persons who benefited directly from what? Direct contracting. Now, that is a sacrosanct rule. And it's very clear, Mr. Golding.
And nobody held accountable.
It's very clear in law, and that's one of the things that Jump wants to do for the public. Make it crystal clear, because sometimes we complicate it. When is direct contracting allowed? Only in 6 instances. If the supplier is the only person with the skill, that cannot apply in any of those 3. If the supplier is the only one with the goods. If it's a matter of confidentiality, like JDF or JCF, not for food for detainees, Mr. Golding, if public safety is threatened or if it is a national concern. Those are the only reasons why. Now, we have 81%, and Jeanette could go on and tell you about Rural Agricultural Development Authority, Ministry of Education. I will just sum it up by putting it this way to you, Mr. Golding. The quarterly contract awards that the Integrity Commission and the Contractor General has a wonderful best practice that Jamaica should be proud of. For the last 15 years, they have documented any contract over $500,000. We have 179,465 contracts documented. Out of all of those, 67% of those were done without public tender in the last 15 years. Now, as a former prime minister, as one who I know is very familiar with the PAC and PAC, does that sound troubling to you, Mr. Golding? 68%. What that means is that we didn't have competition. We don't know if we're necessarily getting value for money. But most importantly, we tend to bad up the private sector and say how they're complicit in these things. But the private sector is actually the first group that is impacted by this kind of direct contracting, because there are young companies out there that will never get a chance to tender and get a fair shot at it, because 68% of our contracting in the last 15 years just got to somebody who we know. So I'm saying this is a very simple issue, Mr. Golding, of the government just respecting what the government's auditor is saying, and we could nip a significant amount of the concerns around nepotism, cronyism, and corruption in the body. It is made to look more complicated than it is.
Well, I'm sure you would have had a chance to look at the legislation under which the Integrity Commission was set up.
Yes.
To what extent does that address, because that wouldn't have been a 15 years vintage, to what extent does that address these loopholes that you're talking about?
Oh, that is a beautiful question, because I think it has actually created gaping holes. Instead of, we have this chain of accountability, and instead of strengthening the weaker part of it, it has actually created a chasm. What do I mean by that? This very same best practice that I'm so proud of, the Section 56.1 of the Integrity Commissions Act now precludes and prevents any Jamaican from knowing what the public, it prevents us from knowing how our public funds are being used. What do I mean by that? The Integrity Commission is probably still collating this data, Mr. Golding, but the Integrity Commission is no longer allowed to update this database, which tells the media, which tells even the Auditor General, which tells the public how is our money being spent, who is getting the contracts, by what means did they get it, and who approved it. That's the extent of the detail in this database that is on the website of the Integrity Commission. But thanks to how the government has interpreted this law, we, the public, are no longer allowed access to information about how our monies are spent.
There have been concerns raised about, for example, the gag clause and so on. Do you know whether or not any review of this is
pending
on the cards?
Yes, it actually has been lost for a 2-year review, but the government has agreed, and there is a joint select committee that will be meeting, and they have invited all members of the public, civil society, to submit our concerns by the 14th of February. But I have to admit, as you know, Mr. Golding, no law is ever perfect, yeah? Always need some tweaking and strengthening. But it should be of concern to the Jamaican people that we have a law that could ever be interpreted in a way to suggest that we don't have a right to know how our taxes are being.
Well, that comment now takes me to the point I want to wrap up with you on, and that is it's something that you spoke about earlier. Mm-hmm. To what extent is the public, exclude yourself because you are one of a kind, but to what extent is the public engageable on these matters? And the other side of that question, are there sufficient facilities in place that would accommodate public engagement?
Right, wonderful. Thanks for that question, Mr. Golding. Now, JAMP, in essence, is really citizens who have designed some tools primarily with the citizen in mind. And what I mean by that is in founding this organization, I thought about what did I want all these years when I wanted to engage, whether I was in the diaspora or whether I was at home but felt disempowered. And there were two things. One had to do with access to information, reliable and credible information. And two, access to the accountable and the responsible public officials. And that is what JAMP has basically been designed. We have 3 trackers now that basically put citizens in a position like us to use something the government gave us, which is our access to information legislation. And rather given to the 9-day wonder problem, we follow through these breaches in the Auditor General's report. We upload what we're getting back from the ministry, departments, and agencies.
How is it going? What has the response been like?
Well, I tell you the truth, it has been a combination of things. We're only 2.5 years old. COVID gave us quite a beating because you have to understand how this impacted government. And so the turnaround on a number of those ATIs have been slower than usual. However, we used to have a 40% turnaround, and I don't think, Mr. Golding, that is necessarily a bad thing. I want to say the Ministry of Finance, by the way, has an exceptional ATI team that has really encouraged us to get what we want. We get it in the time that the law says, and I just want to encourage other citizens. The other thing we do is that we track accountability with our parliamentarians, their attendance, access to the asset declaration, the Constituency Development Fund, what are they doing with it? And the last one is the legislative tracker, which really is trying to unpack and demystify the parliament for the people. So these are 3 tools we have. And in the next month, we're adding a budget tool and a procurement tool. Believe me, Mr. Golding, that if we basically teach the people of Jamaica how the parliament runs, what happens to our money, and give them access to the people in charge, which is what the website does, I believe we can have a game changer for citizen engagement.
Well, I want to encourage you. I want to commend you for the work that you're doing. How long has your organization been in existence?
2.5 years, with the support of the European Union and the private sector organization of Jamaica, who are our partners.
Good. Well, thank you so very much for joining me today. It has been very useful.
Let me just say this much, Mr. Golding, especially to the members of the diaspora. It was really designed with you in mind, so there is no gap between you using your voice. And the website, if you don't mind doing it, Mr. Golding, is www.dampja.org. Thank you so much. I appreciated the time.
Good. Thank you very, very much, Ms. Jeanette Calder, Executive Director of the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal. I was very impressed with that discussion. We should have linked with New York. Beauregard, are you there?
Good afternoon, Mr. Golding.
What happened, Chief?
I'm here.
How many feet of snow did you climb out from under last night?
Oh man, I want to tell you, so we get about 2 feet of snow across the area, over the weekend.
What you saying? Probably worth up in Boston, huh?
Yes, yes. In some places it was very, very crazy. The roads are still covered in snow. There's ice in some areas. Some places haven't been plowed yet. People are still without electricity in some areas also, and even the trains have been delayed. And school starting this morning was delayed because of the snow.
Well, if people can do it without leaving their homes, they better stay here, no?
Yeah, but some people have to touch the road.
I know. But I remember some years ago, my daughter called me. Tell me she was trying to get home. She was at college, and she was trying to get home. And she said that the little car she was driving was just skating all over the road.
Yes, that's one of the major problems that we have when the snow falls. You see a lot of pile-ups happening all over the place. So, we encourage people that if they don't need to be on the roads, they definitely should stay off of it.
Yeah, hail up all the Jamaicans up there for me, and tell them must keep warm now. And
I definitely will do that. And hail up all Jamaicans in Jamaica, and tough luck to the reggae boys, man. We were looking forward to a win over Panama, but unfortunately, they lost 3-2. So.
What else is new, Beauregard?
Big them up same way.
All right, thanks a lot. All the best to you.
All right, same to you.
We're discussing governance today. What governance mean, and how Jamaica is faring out. And I'm very pleased to bring on somebody who not with me yet, but we're trying to get him on the phone because he's someone who has spent a lot of time through his organization. I'm talking about Professor Dr. Trevor Munroe, who is the Executive Director of the National Integrity Action. And it's an issue that I know that they have kept under very close watch. And one of the things that I'm going to ask him to do is to help us to sort of unpack and understand the global index, where Jamaica falls on that. But it's an important issue. As I said, democracy is a live something, it's not a mechanical thing. It's not a matter of, you go vote and you elect a government and then you go about your business and the government go about its business. No, democracy involves making sure that government functions, making sure that government is responsive, making sure that government is held accountable. I mean, that information that Ms. Calder gave me a while ago is frightening. I'm going to dig a little deeper into it. 67%, I think she said, of contracts awarded over the last 15 years did not comply with the procurement requirements in terms of competitive bidding and so on. There are provisions, there are special, and she mentioned them. There are particular situations where competitive bidding is not possible, is not appropriate. Let me give you an example. You have an earthquake or you have a hurricane, and you need equipment out there to go clear roads. You don't have time to put out no invitation to bid. You have to just grab equipment where you can get them. So there are provisions there made for emergency sourcing, and there are provisions made for if it is only one person who has the equipment, then what's the point in putting out a bid? I'm going to bid you a price that is 2 times what it should be. It's better you call him in and just negotiate directly. So there are provisions for that. But 67%, no. I mean, there's no way that could be justified. It's something I'm going to follow up on. We have online with us Professor Lloyd Waller from the Department of Government at the University of the West Indies. Professor Waller.
Mr. Golding, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. You hearing me well now?
Yeah, man, everything is clear.
Good. In the discussions I've been having, I pulled out a scorecard, and we seem to be doing well in some areas in terms of, the fundamental rights, the right to vote, freedom of expression, press freedom, and so on. We seem to be doing well in terms of political stability. We have periodic elections, and we have the transfer of power, which is almost seamless and incident-free. We have a fairly robust regulatory framework, which is where we have to protect citizens from one another, so that one citizen doesn't do what he wants at the expense of another.
Right.
There are certain areas where we fall down. Rule of law. And that has to do not so much with the absence of a legal system, but the question of enforcement of the laws. There's the issue of corruption. Ms. Jeanette Calder cited a statistic a while ago that worries me. 67% of the contracts awarded over the last 15 years were in violation of the procurement rules. It's something I really need to go look at. But one area that comes up when we talk about governance has to do with the effectiveness of government in terms of the delivery of public services, no?
Yeah.
Now, I wanted to focus on that with you and ask you the question, to what extent are we as Jamaicans demanding too much of government? I mean, Professor Alvin, for example, says that we haven't been able to deliver as well as would have been appreciated, largely because we have resource shortages, we have infrastructure shortages, human resource problems, and so on. But is it that governments of Jamaica, made up of whichever party, are really being called upon to take care of people from the womb to the tomb, when we should really spend some time trying to define, well, what do you have governments for? What's the purpose of government? And can we therefore identify what those purposes are and hold the government's feet to the fire on those specific responsibilities? What do you think?
All right. So there are several issues here. So first, looking at efficiency as a moment of good governance, and then asking questions about the role of the state, especially their role as it relates to the provision of welfare. And I think the third issue you raised had a lot to do with the state of affairs. So let me just go in that particular order. And let's speak to efficiency in government. So efficiency is one of the 8, some would say 9, moments of what good governance is, what governance can be recognized as, the typical definition for governance. And there are many definitions, but the one that I tend to generally focus on that is one that sees governance as a kind of state or framework of management, which essentially represents a negotiated system or a set of discourses or some social practices, the rules, the policies, the principles, and so forth that are designed to ensure transparency, accountability, inclusion, participation, value consensus, respect for the rule of law, and efficiency. So let's start to talk about efficiency. Now, citizens generally have a right to ask for particular services. Typically, citizens have a right to the delivery of good government services. Very often, citizens are able to compare government services and products here locally and abroad, and as a result of that comparative impetus, they tend to want something that is similar elsewhere. So, for example, when I was living in New Zealand, I remember that they had all of the government agencies that had to do with starting a business in one location. So it was one building, and you start on the first floor, and you get document A, move to the second floor, then you move to the third floor, and you work yourself up. And that's what is called a kind of that's an efficient kind of mechanism for facilitating the start of a business. And we don't have that here. And certainly someone like me would have been exposed to that kind of mechanism and would want more here to be able to start a business. I would also share my experiences with others who would also demand more. So on one hand, we have a situation whereby the demands will change because standards change, systems change, processes change, and citizens will want that kind of service delivery based on what they know. Unfortunately, because of the financial resources that are lack thereof that governments tend to have here in Jamaica, and I don't think we need to go into a long conversation about debt servicing and how monies are spent, although a counter-argument could be about issues of priority. The realities are that the financial resources are not there to facilitate good service delivery. That being said, we cannot underscore the fact that in the last 2 years alone, the current GOJ has done a lot as it relates to enhancing the efficiency of the government of Jamaica through the use of digital technologies. So there's a lot of digitalization that has happened. This is the scanning of documents, and then there's a lot of digitization that has happened, which is the scanning of documents, and then there's a lot of digitalization that has happened, which is the use of these documents. And many different government agencies are now online, are now facilitating that kind of swift engagement and enhancement of the quality of the service that they have to offer. So it's not just efficiency, but it's also the quality of service. So in the last 2 years alone, because of what has happened with COVID, not just in Jamaica, but around the world, a lot of governments have accelerated their, let's use a general term here, their digital transformation tools, which has encouraged and created that space for e-government to be implemented and rolled out in many of these countries. But here in Jamaica, for example, we have examples of the RGD, with their online services as it relates to deaths and marriages and births. We have now, you can pay for your driver's registration online now, just sitting down around your computer. So we're getting there. And the good thing about technology, the good thing about digital technologies in particular, is every year they get smaller, easily accessible, and cheaper, and are easily available. So we are able to address the issues surrounding efficient government, and we're actually doing so. When it comes to the rule of law, that's a different conversation. A large part of the rule of law issue has to do with the fact that although it falls squarely under governance, for the most part, a lot of it has to do with the legal aspect of it. It's not fully taught outside of law and outside of some courses in the Department of Government, conversations surrounding the rule of law doesn't really exist. You hardly hear this conversation being had, and even if you have someone who, let's say, for example, breached curfew because of their substantive title, the conversation tends to focus a lot on corruption or lack of accountability, but not necessarily a question of whether or not the person respected or adhered to or did anything to facilitate or adhered to the rule of law. So it's not a typical conversation. So because of an issue as it relates to one's awareness of the rule of law, one does not really recognize how important it is to governance and more so to development. And it's not just a Jamaica problem, it's a global problem. And as a result of that, the World Justice Project has launched what is called its World Justice Report, with some very brilliant ways of connecting the importance of the rule of law to business, to government, to society, and to individuals, and how the rule of law plays a critical part of development in your country. So, for example, even though the doing business report is not a thing these days because of the World Bank's reassessment of the methodological and statistical challenges surrounding how it usually articulates through here. The truth is, the rule of law in that particular conversation played an important role as it relates to whether or not persons would invest in your country because of the concern that they have that there's a breakdown of the rule of law, and as a result of that, their investments would be in jeopardy, or if there is a situation surrounding their investments in that particular country, then there would not be a fair treatment of
I'm going to be as unfair to you as I was to Jeanette Calder. I won't put you on the spot.
Uh-huh.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate us in terms of governance, quality of governance?
Well, Mr. Golden, it's a very interesting question you've asked.
Yeah, I want the answer.
Before Donald Trump. You see, and it's very difficult to respond, Mr. Golden. But I would personally say, let's say 6. Let's say 6, based on what I know. And I'm saying 6, but I'm also going to justify and qualify my conversation. So rule of law has essentially 9 moments, right? Accountability, transparency, efficiency, effectiveness, participation. That's 5. What I missed out? Rule of law, 6. Value consensus, 7. And I'm missing somebody. Inclusion, equity, 8. And if we were to go down the line, let's start with the inclusion part. We've not really done much studies as it relates to issues of inclusion, but I'm not necessarily, with the exception of a few conversations about being excluded from being able to access resources based on your politics. It's not necessarily a very substantive issue. And the truth be told, I myself and a couple of colleagues did do a study early last year and the year before, looking at issues of political victimization and to what extent political victimization played an important role in excluding people. And we didn't find a substantive amount of conversation or stories where that is concerned. I mean, it's not like, for example, in the United States, we're hearing stories of tribalism and entire political parties and caucuses being excluded from being able to participate in the democratic process or the decision-making process in organizations. So if we look at them, if we were to break, and I don't think we have the time to break down each one.
No, because I'm running out of time.
Right. The ones that we're failing on, let's say, issues of transparency and accountability / corruption. Those are big-ticket items. And those big-ticket items play an important role in the conversation about governance, but more so, it impacts on the development of your country.
Yeah.
So those who are very poor on rule of law also, some persons would include human rights as a conversation with governance, some don't, but for some who do also, there are some questions as it relates to human rights.
So what you're saying is that we are in a position where we can identify the ones where we have serious shortcomings.
Yes.
And perhaps we need to multiply the focus on those, no?
Yes, certainly. Certainly, a conversation. We talk about governance generally, but the reality is that we need to look at the individual variables to get an understanding of the whole conversation of governance. I'm really seeing that happening. But I want, before the time runs out, I'd like to quickly say that part of the problem has to do with a lack of civics in the high school and the primary school and the Department of Government. When I started that department, I started what was called the Governance Society, which is a group of students in the Department of Government who go around to the high schools and primary schools and raise awareness about the 8 moments of good governance and allow the high schools themselves to start. When we started, the reality were that no one else was doing anything like this, and this was new to high school students. When the youth students went and they designed their own programs. They designed.
Sounds like a good topic for another program, but I got to run. Thank you very much, Professor Lloyd Waller. I hope that we have Professor Munroe on the line now.
I'm with you now, Bruce.
You're with me now.
Yes, absolutely. And
are you one of those buried under 3 feet of snow?
It feels that way, but not really. I'm actually in Fort Lauderdale in Florida, which is pretty chilly, but thankfully none of that snow. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Today we're talking about governance. When you taught me government and politics at the University of the West Indies more than 50 years ago, Lord have mercy, more than 50 years ago.
Yep. Boy, I can't believe it.
That word was not in the lexicon. When did this business of governance emerge as an area that needs to be focused on?
I think in the 1990s, and what it allows us to do is not just to focus on the formal structures of what we call government, but rather the way in which organizations which impact how society functions are actually run. In other words, the structure of power. So you have governance in communities now, which unfortunately in Jamaica and many of the 700-odd communities is governance by gangs. So what it does allow us to do is look at governance outside of government, how our public-private sector corporations run, etc., etc. So it does broaden it, but it does not allow us to forget the fundamental structures that you've been talking about. And I want to commend you on the quality of the program and the inputs you have had. At the same time as commend you, I don't think I've ever done this publicly, for actually putting forward one of the most comprehensive and critical programs for strengthening Jamaica's governance. And I'd invite our listeners to go back and look at your presentation as Prime Minister on May the 17th, 2010, where you actually outlined 14 items which would strengthen Jamaica's governance arrangements, 8 of which have so far been done: the appointment of a special prosecutor for corruption, whistleblower legislation, INDICOM, the libel law reformation. Many people don't recall that this was arising from the initiative which you begun to remove criminal libel from our legislation. So I wanted to mention this and to say that the remaining aspects of the agenda you outlined remain absolutely important. The provision for the impeachment of public officials, you indicated that in 2010 as a critical element of our governance. Term limits for the Prime Minister, this is another proposal you put forward. Vesting constitutional authority in the Electoral Commission, critical. Right now, our Electoral Commission, which is a world leader, can be simply abolished by a majority vote in a government so minded. The question of a criminal sanctions for breaches of the award of contracts. That was one of the proposals we put forward, which Jeanette referred to the extraordinary levels at which right now that whole procurement process is being violated. The issue of parliamentary oversight of the appointment of certain statutory positions. These are all.
Well, let me ask you this, Trevor. I don't know if you were able to hear the discussion I had with Jeanette Calder, but she said to me that 67% of the contracts awarded over the last 15 years were in breach of the procurement guidelines.
Absolutely. Let me give you another.
Where was that ball dropped?
Well, let me tell you. The Auditor General's report last year looked at a compendium of awards of public contracts for infrastructure alone. 769 contracts over a period of 4 or 5 years. Do you know what percentage was awarded on the basis of competitive tender? 9%. 9%. So this is a huge area where law needs to be enforced. And one of the areas of enforcement, of course, is Section 20 of the Financial Administration and Audit Act, which provides the Financial Secretary with the authority after investigation to tell officers who are in breach, pay back the money.
Trevor, hold that point there. Let me digest that point there. I have to take the final break of the program, but I'm coming back to you in less than 5 minutes. We're talking with Professor Trevor Munroe. We're talking about the question of governance. Trevor, what I wanted to ask you is this. You identified a number of things that are still on the to-do list, no? Like the impeachment of public officials. And I think you acknowledge that there are a number of things that are in place. Are they working efficiently? Are we making them work? And I want to add a rider to that. I don't know that it's reasonable to ask government to hold government accountable. I don't think it's reasonable to ask government to put their own feet in the fire. To what extent is civil society sufficiently alert, assertive, engaged to not only make sure that the provisions, the framework that we already have in place, like the question of the award of contracts, to make sure that it works as it's supposed to work, and to also put pressure on the to-do list to get those things off that list and implemented? Where are we?
Short answer, not doing enough. Longer answer, it takes cash to care. What we have found is that when civil society and its experience is instructive in this regard, when we're pushing hard in relation to public visibility, as you know, in Jamaica, out of sight, out of mind, we get very significant response from the public. And I give you one example where a plus that has been very little noticed, and that is in relation to the matter of tolerance of bribery. That was over 50% on the surveys done in the middle of it, 2006, 2007. By 2012, 13, that had gone down to below 30, about 32%.
Which one is that?
One of the tolerance of bribery.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
Which is identified in the studies that have been done in the hemisphere as one of the most important. In fact, we were the leading country in terms of the decline in tolerance of bribery. But your broader question is, are the systems working? And I would say, yes, they're working in relation to the Auditor General's Department. Yes, they're working in relation to other institutions. Where I think the gap is the one to which you point. And that is the extent to which public pressure, citizen engagement, allows the rest of the system to work. And I give you the example that we were just talking about. Those 769 contracts awarded for infrastructure, road infrastructure in particular, worth 8.9 billion Jamaican dollars, Bruce, and only 9% to competitive tender. So you're talking about two issues here. One is a country with scarce resources that can't pay our police or teachers or nurses not being assured of getting value for money that we're spending. And the second issue, even more important, this business of the rule of law to which you have been referring all along. Inequality before the law, identified and diagnosed as early as 2007, the Justice Sector Reform Task Force, where the wealthy litigant, well-connected litigant, is far more likely to either evade or get away. That continues to today. Just contemplate this. Could you or I break a law and the disclosure that we have broken the law is apparent for 10 years and nothing happens? That's the situation in many of our public bodies, spending billions of dollars, breaking the law.
But you know, Trevor, where I have the difficulty, and I'm not providing any cushion for any public official, particularly elected ones. But as I said to Jeanette Calder earlier, if somebody were to post a video of me beating the hell out of my wife, or pointing a gun at somebody's head, or flogging my child to death, police going to be at my door very quickly. Why? Not because anybody made a complaint, not because anybody given a statement, but because they have now been provided with information through a Facebook post of something that is against the law. And they're going to come there because they're going to want to see the gun that I was pointing at somebody to see whether it's licensed. The point I'm making is, the Auditor General presents a report. There is information you say about a public official who for 10 years has not complied with the law.
It's a public agency.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, who is it, and why doesn't that who take the necessary action to put that official before the court? I mean, what they're waiting on? They're waiting on some civil society organization to put pressure, or they're waiting on some call from somebody to say, good God, man, this thing been going on for 10 years. Do something about it, no? The ball is being dropped at places where, quite frankly, if I was in office today, I would want to take out a sample of them, and I would want to say, now, who is it that failed to do what they were supposed to do here, so?
Absolutely. Now, the question then turns to a matter of leadership. For 5 years, with all that we have seen disclosed by extraordinarily positive work by our investigative journalists, by our Auditor General, matters have been referred, and not one single surcharge under the law has been imposed on any public official. No. In August 2020, the Financial Secretary wrote a circular to every single public body saying, look, this chronic violation of law has to cease. If it doesn't cease, we're going to take action. And I'm noticing in 2021, the recommendation from the Auditor General that a surcharge be investigated to be imposed on the former acting permanent secretary in the Ministry of Education. I'm hoping and praying that that represents a turning point, largely because of the extent of public exposure, public outcry, which is an important component, I think you were looking at earlier on, to getting action from the authorities. Whether it's action to appoint the Chief Justice, who should not have been kept acting, but was appointed within 1 month, when the various public bodies cried out, the Bar Association, National Integrity Action, whether it relates to Petrojam, when nothing was happening until there were media reports every day, social media went alight, so that the issue of, for high society, not for lowly people, they no need no exposure. They don't wear a mask in St. Thomas, the young lady is picked up and she's fined $200,000, right? So there's an inequity in the rule of law, which is what is reducing public trust and confidence, not just in existing political leaders, but the entire democratic system in Jamaica, so that the surveys done in 2018 for the hemisphere show that Jamaica has the highest proportion of its population, which is now saying to deal with two things, the twins, crime and corruption, you need an authoritarian solution. Now that's the amber light on the dashboard. And therefore, Bruce, when we look at current situations, you put the small man before the courts immediately. Real cases, a man thief act him, shouldn't thief it. He's with it before the courts in 3 months and sentenced to 6 months. A few years ago, a minister of state is charged. His case takes 6 years, 27 witnesses, and at the end of the day, no case to answer. Currently, former Minister Reid is before the courts. Each year, it's now 2 years, we hear issues raised, perhaps justifiably by very clever defense lawyers, because that's what the 2007 Justice Sector Task Force report pointed to, that the well-heeled litigant is able to get the kind of justice, so to speak, before the courts, which the poor man, despite the legal aid systems which have been strengthened and which NI has been working with the Legal Aid Council, he can't get.
Well, I noticed that the Chief Justice has been expressing some exasperation with that.
Exactly so, but the Chief Justice himself, and again the importance of leadership. Institutions matter, their design matter, but leadership matters. In the case of the current Chief Justice, he's building on the work of the previous Chief Justice, and we now have guidelines for the conduct of judges. We never had that before. We have sentencing guidelines where you and I can go and see what are the matters that a judge has to take into account in sentencing an individual. If we want to think the guidelines are inadequate, then we can make representation. And thirdly, most importantly, for the first time, we have a strategic plan for the judiciary, which deals with one of the issues we raised earlier on, which is court backlog. So every 3 months, you and I and any Jamaican citizen can go on the website of the Supreme Court, the parish courts, and you can see the extent to which they are dealing with the indicators that are set out as part of the plan. And one of them, of course, is reduction in case backlog. And I'm happy to say that there's very significant progress being made in that perennial area, which has hampered our ability to deal with the criminal justice issues as far as we had them. But I wanted to say one thing, Bruce, and that is in governance, report after report tells us what is to be done. Where I think we have fallen down in diagnosis, and probably you and I may have to have another program to discuss that, is how is it to be done? And we have sufficient experience now to indicate that to get over serious resistance from vested interests who benefit from the existing governance arrangements, you really do need what is called multi-stakeholder engagement. Let me go back as far as in the 1970s and coming forward to the Electoral Commission reform. Remember the extent to which citizens' action for free and fair elections have to be involved with you and the Electoral Commission, as it was. It wasn't that then. The Electoral Advisory Committee, Archbishop Carter, I remember being vice chairman of the cafe at the time, engaging not just the government, but interested stakeholders getting involved. Similarly with the fiscal crisis, where you, in fact, proposed in 2010 that fiscal responsibility legislation should be passed, but it was the engagement of EPOC that combined multi-stakeholder group that was able to get us back on track in terms of fiscal responsibility. And today, we have the Consensus Crime Management Oversight Committee. And in agreeing with Alvin, I would say that this is the body which involves both the government, Prime Minister Holness, leader of the opposition, Phillips as he was then, 20-odd civil society groups, including National Integrity Action, have put together and come to an agreement on 26 deliverables in August of 2020. We are now in January of 2022. 6 or 7 of the 26 have been agreed on. Again, in my opinion, not enough public pressure because the public doesn't know enough about these deliverables, some of which relate exactly to the crime pandemic that we are now facing.
My problem, Trevor, is that I'm out of time, but what I want to do, and I want to sort of get a commitment from you. We are a single issue program, no? Every Monday we focus on one single issue and we go as deep as we can into it. I want to do a program on citizen engagement. The extent to which I don't want to overstate it, right? Because there has been a huge difference when you look at citizen activism now compared to what it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
I agree with that program, Bruce.
But there is so much more that can be done, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is that citizen engagement in our country, in our history, comes and goes in cycles. There are peaks and troughs, And right now we are in a trough, but I'm seeing signs that we may be coming out of it with the multiplication of whistleblower reports to the Auditor General's office, as reported in our last annual report last year. So that's a tough subject we need to really interrogate, and I commit to you that as soon as you're ready, I am ready. And we won't have no phone problem in the...
Let's plan to get back to that. But thank you very much, Professor Trevor Munroe, Executive Director of National Integrity Action.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you so much, Trevor. That brings us to the end of the program. Another program, Jamaica Live on Bridge 99. Thank my producer, my studio engineer, the whole of the Bridge 99 team here that treats me so well when I come here. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to seeing you when I come back next week, Monday at midday. Jamaica Live on Bridge 99.